Shroud of Turin made by some form of radiation? And was the image of the man alive and moving while it was forming? That's what we're talking about today, and we're starting right now. For those of you who don't know, the Shroud of Turin is an ancient relic, believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus described in the Gospels. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth. And of course, the cloth resurfaces after the resurrection when Peter and John enter the tomb. So Simon Peter also came, following him, and he entered the tomb, and he looked at the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but folded up in a place by itself. So the other disciple, who had first come to the tomb, also entered then, and he saw and believed. This is a very interesting passage. It refers to two different cloths, a face cloth and the linen wrapping. It was upon seeing these things, the Apostle John believed Jesus was resurrected. There's something about these cloths that helped him believe. And later in this video, we will discuss what it may have been about these cloths that indicated a resurrection had taken place. For those of you who aren't aware, the Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth with two features that are immediately visible to the naked eye. First, it has the faint, full-scale image of a man with arms crossed over his waist, an image of the man's front and his back. Second, the cloth appears to contain numerous bloodstains. In 1898, an Italian photographer, Secondo Pia, made a startling discovery. While developing the first photographs taken of a shroud, he saw that his film's negative image was an anatomically perfect, positive image of a man. Now, if the negative of the image is a positive, then the image itself must be a negative. A very interesting finding that we will explain later as well. Now, before we begin to analyze the new evidence as to whether or not this is the image of Jesus and whether he was moving at the time it was made, both astonishing pieces of information, let's discuss the old evidence first. You may have heard that radiocarbon dating proved the shroud was a medieval forgery. This data came out in 1998, and a major media blitz followed, supposedly debunking the shroud. The major theory at that time was it was a painted forgery by a medieval artist. However, it seems the choice of the samples taken for testing may have come from a medieval repair of the cloth rather than the image-bearing cloth itself. At least 4 scholarly articles have been published on this problem with the previous carbon-14 testing. One of the original experts who tested the shroud became aware of this problem. He retested the shroud and found the original results were in error. The sampled section was the worst possible section to study. Then in 2017, after a Freedom of Information Act request released all the data from the first test, it was discovered that additionally some of the data from the original test was withheld to doctor the results. Because of this, the original test must be discounted entirely. So if the radiocarbon test is invalid, is there any evidence for the age of the shroud? The most extensive battery of experiments was conducted by the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Back in 1978, the group of 24 experts and scientists included Christians, Jews, and atheists. The project issued a final report that was summarized this way, quote, "We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved." If you notice, their research proved that no pigments of any kind were added to the image area of the cloth. Thus, it was not a painted or drawn forgery. They concluded it was a photographic image of some sort, even though it was on a non-photosensitive medium, linen cloth. But how it formed, they were unsure. Later in this video, we'll discuss this because the ideas that are presented are simply amazing. Other tests were done. Images of flowers are seen on the shroud's image. It appears the body was covered with flowers as a sign of affection prior to burial. Botanist Aviom Danin of the Hebrew Institute of Jerusalem determined where the shroud originated based on a comprehensive analysis of the pollen taken from the shroud and the plant images associated with it. Much of the pollen is native only to the area around Jerusalem, and some are not still in existence, which dates the cloth to no later than AD 800. This combination of flowers can be found in only one region of the world, Danin stated. The evidence clearly points to a floral grouping from the area surrounding Jerusalem. Analysis of minute particles of limestone, also found adhering to the shroud, have been identified by Dr. Joseph Kolbeck as a rare form of travertine aragonite. This stone is also only found in Jerusalem, and it's the same as samples from ancient Jerusalem tombs taken by archaeologist Eugenia Nitkowski. So this places the shroud in Jerusalem in a tomb. Those who claim this is some kind of medieval forgery cannot explain these connections to Jerusalem. The blood on the shroud is human, and it happens to be blood type AB, which is rare in most places but common in Israel. And this blood is positioned exactly where the wounds of Jesus were, on his wrists, feet, and the side where the spear pierced him, and on his head where the crown of thorns was placed. In fact, the image shows this horrible crown was still in place when he was buried. Based on the image, it is a sarcopterygium cynosium, which is more commonly called the thorny burnet. Rather than being woven into a wreath like the crown we usually see in paintings, it appears the Romans just took branches of this plant and forced it into a cap shape on his head. This is yet another reason that the shroud can't be a forgery, as medieval artists would have gone with the conventional picture of a wreath-like crown, not this cap of thorns that no one expected to see. There's dirt on the soles of the victim's feet, on his knees, and nose. And the nose of the victim was broken. This seems to indicate the victim may have fallen prior to being crucified and broke and skinned the nose in the process. The victim, carrying a crossbeam, wouldn't have had his hands free to break the fall. So if he fell, his nose would take the brunt. We know that on the way to Calvary, Jesus began carrying his own cross. But sometime later, Simon of Cyrene was conscripted by the Romans to help Jesus carry it. Now, a fall or a collapse that could have broken the nose of the man on the image may have been what caused this man to require help. New carbon dating tests by scientists at the University of Padua in northern Italy used the same fibers from the 1988 test but got different findings. The new examination dates the shroud somewhere between 300 BC to 480, which would put it in the era of Christ. But the greatest evidence that this was the burial cloth of Jesus is the image itself and how it was created. First, the image is superficial. It lies just on the top of the microfibers, something we can't achieve even today with modern science. There was no bleed through like you would expect with paints or dyes. In other words, the image didn't go down into the fibers like paint would or a dye. It stayed right on the very surface. Although the blood did bleed through the cloth with capillary action, the image itself was seared onto the cloth just at the top. Second, the image is a three-dimensional, almost hologram type formation, and there is no other image in the world like this. There are no 2D images in the world that carry 3D information. The darker areas of the image were closer to the cloth and the lighter areas further away. This captured the 3D information about the image. Scientists actually have used this 3D information and have even made a sculpture of the man in the image. Third, the image is a negative, not a positive. No one would paint a negative or backwards image in the 1300s. So for all these reasons, it cannot be a forgery. However, how did the image form? Scientists believe it was a burst, or as we will explain in a second, oscillating bursts of high intensity, single wavelength light, laser light. This is a technology we simply don't have today. Light can create the type of brownish image that exists on the shroud. Just put a newspaper in your window for 2 weeks and you will see it turn this type of yellow-brown. However, it will not form an image like that of the shroud, but the basic idea is the same. Light desiccates and oxidizes the outer layers of the paper or the fabric. But how did it produce an image? The answer is that the light came from inside the body of the man in the image, and it traveled in all directions in exact parallel lines. That's laser light, those exact parallel lines. Scientists have estimated the power to produce this type of image exceeds all the electrical power generated in the entire Earth at one time. It is only possible supernaturally. But this isn't the most amazing aspect of a shroud image. The International Institute for Advanced Studies of Space Representation scientists in Paloma, Italy, have presented research that the body of the man was in motion when the image was produced. Yes, you heard me right. The body appears to have been moving. Now we know that because the image isn't a single exposure, but a combination of multiple exposures, sort of the way a strobe light photography can follow the path of a tennis ball or a golf swing. The image on the shroud shows various objects in motion, like the nails in the man's wrist and feet, the teflon on his arms, and his belt buckle moving up and down with his breath. The Italian Institute's research shows that multiple exposures of these very easy to track items on the body of the man are present in different positions, showing that his hands and feet and his chest, when he breathed, were moving. Current theory is that the light that produced the image was oscillating, producing light in bursts, just like a strobe light would. This accounts for the multiple exposures, one with each burst of light, which in turn accounts for why certain areas of the shroud image are somewhat fuzzy. Movement would make those areas seem out of focus. Now, how could the body of a dead man be moving in the image? This was obviously a burial shroud. The eyes of the man are closed and covered with coins or buttons. So if this is Jesus and he is moving, it is the exact moment of the resurrection prior to him opening his eyes. Can you see why God might want to keep evidence such as that to share with the world? But where did the light come from? This is something that no one can answer other than Jesus himself. One theory is that it came from his DNA activating. It's an interesting theory. Studies from as far back as 1984 show that active DNA produces laser light, but of very low intensity. Now, the DNA of God might have quite a different intensity, like we said, greater than all the electricity on Earth. It is also thought that the body was levitating at the moment the image was being made. And as we know, the resurrection body of Jesus was able to pass through solid objects like the door of the upper room where the disciples were hiding. This could explain why John believed when he saw the burial cloth of Jesus. Had the body of Jesus actually passed directly through this cloth without it having even been opened? And was it lying unopened but empty in the tomb? Now, another theory is that John saw the image of his Lord on the cloth, the Shroud of Turin, the same image we're talking about today. Now, either theory could account for John's reaction. But you know what? I bet you're thinking, hey, wait a minute, Nelson. You've been going on and on. But what was that you said about nails, coins, and a belt buckle? And what's a tefillin? Are all these things on the image of the shroud? The answer is yes, they are. And a whole lot more. If this is the body of our Lord, which seems the only possible explanation, these details tell us a great deal about what he suffered, what he wore, etc. Click right here to keep watching to learn about all the items found on the body of the man on the image of the shroud and what they might tell us about Jesus and his life. This is Nelson.
Hi, I'm
And
William
I'll see you
West,
there.
author of Riddles of the Shroud, Questions Science Can't Answer. Mention the shroud and many people will say, didn't carbon dating prove that shroud thing was a medieval fake? The problem is, most of us know little about the shroud and even less about carbon dating. So let's look at the facts that have helped make the shroud the most researched artifact in human history. Keep in mind, belief in the shroud is not about faith, but about facts. So this is the shroud, a typical burial cloth about 1 metre wide and 4 metres long. The dark diamond shapes are burns from a fire in 1532. The faint images behind them are images of a man front and back covered in real blood. This is how the image was formed. The body was placed on one end of the shroud, which was wound over the head and down the front. The first riddle is that the blood was on the cloth first, before the image, because scientists have shown there's no image under the blood. Putting blood on before the image is the opposite of what any artist would or could do. So how did the image get there? Most shroud researchers are now convinced it could only have come from a burst of light, that is, a burst of electromagnetic radiation. To understand this, it helps to know something about linen cloth. Take the typical linen thread on the left. It's made from incredibly tiny microfibers. Each one is 1/5 the width of an average human hair, like the one on the right, barely visible even in bright light. This is how the microfibers look, magnified 64 times. The big rectangles are linen threads and the tiny filaments are microfibers. The whole image comes from a layer of these discoloured microfibers. There is no paint, pigment, ink or dye on them. In a single stroke, this fact removes any possibility that the shroud images were made by a human hand or by the hand of nature. If they were, more than the surface fibres on the cloth would be affected. If any fluid or gas was involved, it would penetrate much deeper into the microscopic fibres. The only way scientists have been able to reproduce the discoloured fibres is with a burst of ultraviolet light from excimer lasers. They'd calculated that to discolour the whole image area would require 34 trillion watts of electricity in a split second, and that's simply not possible, even today. If it were a forgery, one of the most puzzling things about the shroud would be the fact that the front and back images are so incredibly faint. To even see them, you need to stand 1 metre or 2 back. Any closer or further back and the images simply fade away. Even if a forger could create an image like this, why do it? For a forgery that was meant to be displayed before large crowds. And how could an artist do it? All artists vary the pressure they use to apply paint or any other medium. No artist could create such an extensive layer of discoloured microfibres so that it was perfectly uniform, a fraction of a human hair deep. It's simply not possible. Now, if you ask most people what this image is, they would say the face on the Shroud of Turin, but in fact, it isn't. This is the face on the Shroud. Doesn't look like much, just a blurry smudge. The major blood flows, like the prominent one on the forehead, are clear, but little else is. If you look at the eye sockets in this close-up, they seem almost empty, making the face look like a skull with hair and a beard. Then in 1898, a photographer took the first photo of the Shroud, and looking at the negative, became the first person ever to see this now familiar image, a high-resolution photographic positive image that revealed the Shroud was a photographic negative with lights and darks reversed many centuries before photography was even thought of. The image sent shockwaves around the world. People suddenly realised the Shroud was not a blurry smudge at all, but a photographic image. Look at the eyes now. The sockets are not empty at all. The details are clear. The right eye line here is well defined and straight, but the left eye line is broken, and the reason is there's a huge swelling pushing up against the eyelids. Forensic pathologists have also identified a swelling on the opposite cheek and swollen cartilage on the bridge of the nose here. Skeptics rightly said the negative image was impossible. They claimed that the photographer Secondo Pia had faked up the photo. But when another photographer did the same thing in front of witnesses, skeptics changed tack. They said it was no big deal after all. Science would work it out. After 125 years, we're still waiting. Taken by itself, the high-resolution negative photographic image we see today is still inexplicable, and no artist has ever produced anything like it, certainly not by discolouring microscopic fibres. Then scientists discovered one more impossible feature of the Shroud image. Unlike any photograph, it had three-dimensional properties. Scientists made the discovery when they scanned the image into a computer called the VP8 image analyzer, pictured here, and it is now confirmed by digital photography as well. The discovery revealed the Shroud image is encoded with computer-readable 3D information, with each detail of the image recording the distance between the body and the cloth. And this is the man who created the VP8 image analyzer, engineer Peter Schumacher. Decades after he first came across the Shroud, he's still impressed. As he said in one interview, "The Shroud is a unique image, the only one of its kind in the whole world. Nothing else like it. Three-dimensional relief of the front and of the back of a whole human being. Only one in the world. No other, nowhere, no how, no way. I don't know any way to make it. I never heard of any way to make it, just the Shroud of Turin." Schumacher adds that when he came across the Shroud, he wasn't very religious, but like many Shroud researchers, including some agnostics and atheists, he underwent a conversion. He is now a Catholic deacon. The 3D qualities of the Shroud are so clear they have inspired scientists to create statues. This bronze statue is on permanent display at Jerusalem's Notre Dame Centre. Notice the detail of the abrasions on the knees and the detail of the face, and you'll find links of a number of statues engineered by scientists in the note. Ancient features of the linen cloth itself that place it in the 1st century. And now, new dating techniques have also dated Shroud samples to the 1st century. 3 separate tests carried out by engineering measurements expert Professor Giulio Fanti and colleagues at the University of Padua produced dates consistent with the 1st century. Then, just last year, a team headed by senior academic Dr. Liberato De Caro from Italy's National Research Council also dated the Shroud to the 1st century. They used a technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering. The findings were published in the international peer-reviewed science journal Heritage, but were not reported at all by most of the media. So to sum up the evidence we've looked at, we've seen that the Shroud image has many impossible features that couldn't be created by a forger, including its uniform microscopic image, its high-resolution photonegative qualities, and its 3D features. We've seen the medical accuracy of every aspect of the image, right down to the last trace of blood, the traces of Jerusalem soil and flower pollens. We've seen that the carbon dating was flawed, confirmed by historical evidence including coins, icons, the Pray manuscript, the Sudarium of Oviedo, and the primitive features of the cloth itself. And all of this is confirmed by the new tests that date it to the 1st century. So these days, if anyone asks me, do you really think that Shroud thing is Jesus' burial cloth? I can only say, Given the evidence, I can't imagine what else it could be. But could the shroud still be a forgery? Well, after 5 years of research, I can't think of anything less likely. Riddles of the Shroud lists 99 pieces of evidence confirming authenticity, and there's no longer any real evidence that the shroud is a forgery. Add to all this the fact that all the evidence we now have fits the shroud like pieces of a puzzle, and like all puzzles, this one only fits together one way. The scientific details are spelled out in Chapter 9 of Riddles of the Shroud, but in brief. The blood had to come first from a body inside the cloth, creating perfect wounds, blood flows and clots. Then came the photonegative image, fitting the position of the bloodstains perfectly and recording the distance of each part of the body from the cloth, creating the 3D effect. At the same time, the body had to be removed in a way that didn't disturb the blood flows and clots, a physical impossibility unless the body simply dematerialized, an event that appears to have coincided with a burst of light that created the image on the cloth. Hard to imagine? Of course, but that is what the material evidence indicates, and no one has ever come up with an alternative that fits all the facts. In 125 years of modern scientific research, not even close. The main conclusion from all of this takes the form of a question. How could any human being in or before the Middle Ages possibly create a high-resolution photographic negative 3D image formed from a uniform layer of discoloured microscopic linen fibres, perfectly matching the position of a huge network of genuine wounds, blood flows and clots, something countless modern scientists have been unable to achieve, and then plant on the cloth microscopic traces of soil and flower pollen from Jerusalem, the same soil and pollen found on the Sudarium of Oviedo, that also shares the shape of the blood on the shroud, and then remove the body without damaging blood flows and clots. Taken together, these things are too much for most of us to hold in our heads at once, let alone for a primitive forger to envisage and execute. All this evidence surely constitutes a waterproof case, a wall of material evidence that should convince any well-instructed jury that the shroud is authentic. As I said at the outset, belief in the shroud is not a matter of faith, but of fact. Nevertheless, the shroud has led many people to faith and strengthened the faith of many more.
The Shroud of Turin is a burial cloth that shows a man that was scourged, crowned with thorns, crucified, and pierced with a lance. The first reason I believe this is the burial cloth of Jesus are due to the new studies that provide an updated age for the shroud. In 1988, the carbon dating results provided a date in the 1300s. This made many people believe it was a forgery for decades. However, in the early 2000s, Ray Rogers was challenged to look into this further. Here's what he said.
I had given up on the shroud, and this was about the same time that the lunatic fringe were coming up with an infinite number of ways the date could be wrong, and this was just the last straw.
I got a call from Ray, and he goes, "This is nonsense. I can prove these people wrong in 5 minutes." And I said, "Well, Ray, go for it."
So I read their paper, and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. So I got out the Ross samples, and I got out the Shroud samples, and I went to work again.
He discovered that the wrong samples were selected for the dating. He concluded, the radiocarbon sample was thus not part of the original cloth and was invalid for determining the age of the shroud. He also calculated a new date between 1300 and 3000 years old. Again, this is from a well-rated, published peer-reviewed journal. What he believes happened is this.
If you happen to hit a place where a yarn segment from the original shroud was spliced into the new reweave part, the splice very definitely shows the new yarn that was being put in and dyed to match. The only thing in the shroud that was dyed or stained was this radiocarbon area.
His findings were confirmed by John Brown from Georgia Tech and Bob Villarreal from Los Alamos National Laboratory. I've received many comments that say that Wikipedia disagrees with the findings of Ray Rogers, so we should ignore it. However, I would recommend looking into the sources, as they even mention that the date may be incorrect. The carbon-14 date has led many people to believe that this is not the burial cloth of Jesus, although it's amazing that someone from the actual Shroud Turin research project wrote a paper refuting that. In October 2019, an analysis of the raw data showed inconsistencies and requested a new carbon-14 date. While these are promising results, a new sample and carbon dating will be needed. The second reason is related to a March 2019 study where a replica of the Shroud of Turin was attempted. The results stated that the perfect reproduction of the Turin shroud remains a challenge since many other characteristics of the original image have not yet been obtained with any of the processes used for reproduction to date. That basically means that even with the most sophisticated technology available today, we cannot replicate the Shroud of Turin. A similar experiment was conducted in 2012, and from that experiment, we saw the amount of watts necessary to create an image with just some of the properties. It would look something like this. That was the Dallas Cowboys Stadium. With every light on, 750 megawatts are used. Dr. Paulo Di Lazzaro, who led the 2012 study, told National Geographic that it would take several billion watts to create the image. Another thing to factor in is that 750 megawatts are being used throughout the stadium. What science is telling us is that a dead body would have to exude billions of watts to create the image on the shroud. No mere human could do that. But Jesus, the God-man, could. As he illuminated during the transfiguration, he surely illuminated in an even greater way during his resurrection, which is recorded on the Shroud of Turin for us. Also, it would take 10,000 of these lasers to create the image on the shroud, which exceeds the maximum power released by all ultraviolet light sources available today. That statement says it all. We don't have the capability to replicate the shroud. So every Easter, when we remember the resurrection, think about the power of Jesus. Think about that literally explosive power as he rose from the dead to create this image. It's amazing. Now you might be wondering, why can't we replicate all the characteristics of the shroud? This is due to the cloth containing a three-dimensional image. Fabrics are not supposed to contain precise 3D images. As you can see here, a three-dimensional image can be taken from this two-dimensional cloth. This three-dimensional nature inspired the Shroud of Turin research project, also known as STURP, which was the most thorough analysis of the shroud to date. The 33-person team was comprised of experts in various fields who spent 17 months preparing for the analysis. They did incredible work, and here they tested several types of images and were not able to obtain the three-dimensional style that the shroud had. To date, this three-dimensional nature could not be matched. The data from the study actually allowed the face of Christ to be modeled by the History Channel, which you'll see here, as well as this hyper-realistic replica of the shroud, which was developed over 15 years and is very impressive. The fourth reason I believe is that the Shroud of Turin matches bloodstains on the Sudarium of Oviedo. The Sudarium is the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, as mentioned in John 20:7. There was a study that compared bloodstains as well as calcium and strontium deposits between the shroud and the Sudarium. The results suggest that both cloths were used by the same person. The fifth reason I believe is due to the medical accuracy of the shroud. The examiner from the research team wrote, "The largest blood stain on the burial cloth is on the right side of the chest. It covers the area of the 5th and 6th ribs. This stain very clearly shows separation of blood from a clear watery material." What did John's Gospel say? That after Jesus was pierced, blood and water came out. This is medically confirmed here. The examiner even states, "The author cannot help but comment that a remarkable consistency exists between the Gospel accounts and the forensic pathological findings depicted on the Shroud of Turin." Again, another reason I believe. And I think it's interesting too that the examiner states that there's a remarkable consistency between the Shroud and the Gospels. The sixth reason I believe is due to the pollen studies. Max Fry used adhesive tapes to collect dust samples from the Shroud of Turin during the 1978 STURP investigation. He later classified 58 pollen grains by comparing them to pollen grains in the largest botanical museums around the world. He concluded that a majority of the pollen grains were from Jerusalem. The seventh reason I believe is due to the coins placed over the man's eyes. It was a custom to put coins over the eyes of a dead person so their eyes would stay shut while you're carrying them to their tomb. This was indicated initially by the STURP team and published in the Numismatist. This was confirmed by imaging analyst expert Robert Haralick, who said the shroud did indeed contain a faint image of the Pilate coin. So we have a man that was tortured the way Jesus was, had his side pierced, had bloodstains that matched the headcloth attributed to Jesus, had coins on his eyes that were minted by Pontius Pilate, was in Jerusalem according to pollen samples, and had an explosion of ultraviolet light to create a 3D profile of his crucified body. This has got to be Jesus. There is no natural explanation for this. The eighth reason I believe is that there is AB blood on the shroud. The blood that is on the sudarium is also AB blood, and so is the blood from every other Eucharistic miracle. When I read that the blood on the Shroud of Turin was the same as all the Eucharistic miracles, I thought, wow, God, you are brilliant. So in conclusion, all these reasons point to the fact that faith and science do not contradict. We wouldn't have this phenomenal data without science. This is an example of God illustrating his incredible power through scientific discoveries. Again, please like this video, share it with others, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. God love you.
Deep down inside, people have a fear of being condemned. So when people say the Shroud of Turin is a fake or that angel footage is fake, that's their response to fear. And the forensic facts and the truth be damned. Because at the end of the day, it's all about me and what I want, and I want that to be fake. We are looking at the finest quality replica of the Shroud of Turin that exists in the world. $2,000. This is our best fake. The best imitation of the shroud that exists in the world. Yet under microscopic examination, under high-powered microscope, we could zoom in and in less than 60 seconds discover immediately, oh, they used pigment to make this. This is man-made. When the Shroud of Turin research project went to Turin, Italy, the first thing they did was they looked at the shroud image under high-powered microscope. To their amazement and surprise, guess what? No paint. You cannot hide paint from high-powered microscopes. How much faster do you think we could debunk anyone else's fake of the shroud as being exactly what it is, an imitation of the original, but not matching any of its unique characteristics? We are going to be looking at close-ups of the highest resolution images of the shroud that exist. Of course, we can see visible teeth. We can see the metacarpal bones in the hand. This is a partial X-ray image. Left hand over right wrist and fingers are bent, and the image that resides on the top layer of this Syrian weave 8x2 cubit pure linen cloth only penetrates 1 or 2 micrometers into the 15 micrometer wide fabric. It is a scientific impossibility to create an image with this kind of superficiality by touching it with any kind of man-made object. The coloring process is not due to adding material to the cloth, but non-material entities, such as radiated energy coming from the body, charged particle radiation, and or electromagnetic radiation. When this image process took place, there was separation between the body and the cloth. That is an inescapable forensic fact of this case, in spite of the mass amount of false info about the shroud on internet. This image contains high-resolution, forensically accurate 3D info. To create forensically accurate 3D info, you must have a forensically accurate 3D body as the role model. That is the key word, forensically accurate. That was confirmed by forensic pathologists and also confirmed by a scientific instrument, a VP8 analyzer, an impartial witness that doesn't care if Jesus is the Son of God or not. And this witness tells us with certainty the body was levitated between the two halves of the cloth during the image process. There is no escaping that fact.
This is what the Shroud of Turin really looks like, not the high contrast internet version that most people see. And step back, you can see how subtle the image is, and it just barely penetrates the 15 micrometer fibril, only 1 or 2 micrometers. And separation of colored versus uncolored fibers to make up this image, little pixelated microscopic dots, is separated at 15 micrometers. That's the max possible on the linen. Couldn't be better than that. At various points of the image, not the resolution of the whole image, but where the body was close to the cloth. Of course, the hands. You can see the metacarpal bones. Areas of the image that were farther away from the cloth didn't image at all. In some cases, the feet. You'll notice on the image in the shroud, there's no image here at all. It completely fades out. You can only see blood stains. So the part of the body during the image process that had the greatest separation of all is here. There's the knees. As you can see, the image process stops completely. There's nothing. No feet. Where are the feet at? The feet were too far away from the cloth to image. It's not saying that there was not a light energy coming out of that part of the body, but having that extra distance it has to travel.
by inverse square law, when that moving electrical signal has to go from here to here, it slows down in Hertz frequency. Let's say it started out at 3 trillion cycles per second. By the time it gets to there, it slows down to 1 trillion cycles per second. But that difference in Hertz frequency, when this light energy from the body makes contact with the fabric, is no longer sufficient enough to cause the rapid aging effect. And that's because the feet were too far away from the cloth for the image process to take place. Same thing would happen if we attempted to make a hologram of this rock and we move this away from the film plate too far. We're going to get no image at all. So the image process on the Shroud of Turin, the forensic evidence tells a story of what?
A paranormal event. A paranormal event. Love is more powerful than death, powerful than death.
The hands were close. The face was close. The face was the closest of all. That's why the face has such good resolution. And why are those lines along the side of the face? It's 2 blank lines. Make note of that. Well, there's 2 lines going down each side of the face image. That's just virgin fabric. It's untouched. There's nothing there. And you see the same thing when you make, I put the statue in a photocopier scanner, and wow, lo and behold, I'm getting those dark lines along the sides. That's because there's too much distance there as well between the scanner and the face for that to image. The same thing with a hologram. Hologram is not going to image the side of this rock. Can't. It's extremely compelling evidence of what? That's what it's evidence of. This part of the face did not image at all because it's too far away from the cloth. Plus, it's way on the side. And when the cloth made contact with his face, the blood made contact with the fabric. But when the fabric was pulled straight over his face, and then the image process occurred, it creates the optical illusion that the blood from the side of his face is actually in his hair. And we see that here. These blood stains, those are from the side of the cheek. But what I've done, since this is a museum quality replica of the Shroud, and the separation between those bloodstains is in fact approximately, not exactly to the millimeter, 7 inches. I replicated them on this piece of cloth right here. And we're going to take it and put it on the face of Jesus. This is a life cast body. It's made of flexible rubber. So that's the real dimensions of a real human head. So as you can see, there's a separation about 7 inches between those bloodstains, exactly how they are. And this cloth made contact with a 3-dimensional, real, genuine, dead person, scourged and crucified. There's the nose. There's the forehead there. Sides of the cheeks are here. This blood is making contact with the side of the cheeks. And when I go around to this side and I release that, you can see that. You can clearly see this blood stain that appears to be in the hair because of the image process is what it was actually not. And then of course there's the number 3 blood stain. From the perspective of Jesus on his left side. And this is the position of the cloth during the image process, which was approximately 1 or 2 centimeters away from the face, so it was really close. But this is proof of 3 things.
1, bloodstains are first. 2, the image is a secondary event that occurs 48 to 72 hours after the blood made contact with this fabric. And 3, there was separation between the body and the cloth during the imaging process. Can anyone imagine if you asked 1,000 people to make a face image on linen, illustrate some blood going down the cheeks and some hair, how many people would leave 2 blank lines on their image? Allow me to answer that question. Not one person.
Note, the thumbs are not visible. That's because when a Roman crucifixion nail goes through the wrist, it strikes a nerve and causes the thumbs to turn inward.
Part of the beard section is missing. And people say, well, the man in the shroud looks too old. Did Jesus really have a white beard? Well, did Jesus really have white blood? Of course not. The reason that the beard has what appears to be white in it, that's pulmonary edema fluid and blood that exited the nose and mouth. And we see the same thing here on the head cloth. This is the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, the grave clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. This was the position that Jesus was on the cross when they applied this cloth. 21st century forensic science determined this cloth wrapped the head of a person in an upright position whose head was leaning down 70 degrees down and 20 degrees to the right. And then the body was laid in a horizontal position. But this cloth is kept in Oviedo, Spain. It was authenticated by the Spanish government in the year 1054, March 14th, to be the property of Jesus.
These are the most significant match points from the shroud to the head cloth. Both cloths have type AB blood, the rarest blood type in the world. Both cloths have type AB blood with high bilirubin content. Both cloths have type AB blood with myrrh and aloes, as written in the gospel account. And there came also Didymus, who first came to Jesus by night and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes about 100 pound weight. On these 2 cloths, just to start, we have type AB blood with elevated levels of bilirubin and presence of myrrh and aloes, and pollens from a thorn plant from Jerusalem on both cloths. And it was recently determined that the pollens and the blood arrived on this cloth at the same time. That would get the attention of any forensic detective, homicide detective working on this case and got that lab report back. That would raise that person's antenna. The edema fluid and blood is a match from the side wound on the man of the shroud to this blood here. This is a mixture of pulmonary edema fluid from the lungs and blood. We see that same type of blood coming from the side wound of Jesus. There's a rare calcite that can only be found in tombs around the Damascus Gate, around this area of the cloth where the nose would have been. And also on the Shroud of Turin, in the area of the nose, it's the same type of rare calcite. Point number 7, the radiation damage. This cloth has severe radiation damage, matching the same level of radiation damage as the linen wrappings of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we know are over 2,000 years old. And the Shroud of Turin has what? That same level of radiation damage. An indication of what? Significant age. So the question to ask would be, well, if the shroud has radiation damage on it, severe, matching the radiation damage of the linen wrappings of the Dead Sea Scrolls, how could it be only 500 or 600 years old? Well, there's a simple answer to that question. That can't be possible. 21st century forensic science determined these 2 cloths, the shroud and the head cloth, must be roughly the same age.
The blood on these 2 cloths passed over a dozen tests. To be genuine blood 4 times was required by law. It's not just the rarest blood type in the world, type AB. It's type AB blood with elevated levels of bilirubin, as would be present in a person who died of violent death, mixed with myrrh and aloes,
and pollens from a thorn plant from Jerusalem on both cloths.
We could go through every autopsy report ever filed in the history of the earth and not find another match to that.
It was determined by the Spanish Center for Syndenology, by 21st century forensic science, the person whose head that made contact with this cloth is that person right there.
It's an obvious image of Jesus. Anyone in disagreement with that? You're not being honest with yourself. The crown of thorns. Who else had a thorn plant from Jerusalem put on their head? Who else was mocked as a king, scourged and crucified, and had their right side pierced with a Roman lancia?
A Roman lancia is 4 centimeters in width. A first century Roman lancia. Note those words. First century Roman lancia is 4 centimeters wide. How wide is the side wound on the man in the shroud? 4 centimeters. That's not a coincidence. The fake theory involves adding material to the cloth to create coloring. As soon as you hear that, you know you're getting false information. As soon as you hear someone defend the carbon dating, you know you're dealing with an idiot. We know that test was not valid. We know the samples they tested contained madder root dye and cotton. That's scientifically peer-reviewed. All skeptic fake theories involve adding material to the linen flax to change this color, because that's how people think. Well, in order to create coloring, I have to add something to that linen. I've got to put paint on it. I've got to touch it with some kind of substance from the earth, when in fact that is not true. All skeptic theories are wrong. So the coloring on the shroud is due to a rearrangement of the electrons on the outside of the carbon atoms that make up the linen flax, from single electron bonds to double electron bonds. Linen flax is made up mostly of carbon atoms. Single electron bond carbon atom groups. But where there's coloring on the shroud, that has been changed. The electrons around the outside of the atoms. Look at the outside of the atoms we have on display right now. Notice the shift in position from single electron bonds to double electron bonds. When electrons are rearranged, when they change position, that changes the way that particular creation, that substance, that material, it changes the way it absorbs and reflects light, thus imparts a new color to the molecules. Atoms grouped together form molecules. The only way we've been able to duplicate that process on a few linen fibrils is by firing an argon fluoride laser directed at one of these fibrils at several trillion cycles per second for less than a billionth of a second. It's the only way we've been able to change single electron bonds to double electron bonds. It goes without saying this is not a coloring process they were using back in a medieval time. This is an image not made by human hands. That's why the Shroud of Turin was called the image of Edessa, the image not made by human hands. That's what the Shroud of Turin was called in the early centuries. And you may be asking yourself a question right now and saying, are you telling us that this Shroud of Turin is the true image of Jesus and physical evidence of his resurrection? Yes, that is exactly what I am saying.
Behold, behold, he is coming, he is coming.
The Shroud of Turin research project determined by microchemistry, microphotographs, X-ray fluorescence, infrared and UV light evaluations, no material was added to these linen fibrils to create coloring. If material was added to the linen to create coloring, it would be visible under a high-powered microscope. When people say the shroud is a fake, it's the same thing as saying, I think that the grass, all the grass on the earth, is fake grass. I think some medieval forger was able to paint all the grass green and then hide that from high-powered microscopes. Found some way to paint, add material to grass or to linen and then be able to hide that from microscopes. I painted it, but you can't see it, right? For someone to believe that material was added to the linen fibrils, to the fabric on the shroud to create coloring, but then not be able to see it when those linen fibrils are examined under high-powered microscope, you would have to rank yourself among the stupidest people to ever walk the face of the earth. The superficial image over the bloodstains is not unlike holographic information. If we were to look at the image under a microscope, under a high-powered microscope, the Shroud of Turin image, we would be looking at something like this. Microscopic shades of light and dark, microscopic dots that create the optical illusion of depth. We would all be in 100% agreement. I handed this film plate to somebody, and I said, I want you to analyze this holographic information, and then with your hand, with a statue or with paint, I want you to replicate it. But just replicate it, and here's a sample of it. Make another one. It's a scientific impossibility. Because with the human hand, you cannot create separation of colored versus uncolored parts of a film plate at 15 micrometers. But that's what we have on, guess what? The Shroud of Turin. There's a reason why the Shroud of Turin
has microscopic shades of light and dark that create the optical illusion of depth, forensically accurate to the object, is because it is a holographic image. That's not a random accident. One thing that gives us insight into the image process on the Shroud of Turin would be a laser printer. A laser printer applies toner by controlled electrostatic discharge, meaning electrical signals moving through space, then making contact with the printing medium. In this case, the printing medium is a 3/1 herringbone twill fabric, 8x2 cubits of a Syrian cubit. So a piece of linen is used as a printing medium, a holographic film plate. As difficult or as improbable as that may seem, the forensic evidence tells us with unmistakable clarity the body is this source of light and energy. It's making contact with these fibrils, outer fibrils of linen, causing them to age rapidly. A German radiologist named Dr. Hermann Moder made this statement in regards to his investigation with the shroud. Shroud was used to enshroud a corpse in the image as the result of some form of interaction between body and cloth, and does not derive from the use of paint, powder, acid, or other materials which could have been used to create an image on linen.
This is a quote by Italian scientist Paolo Di Lazzaro, who tried for 5 years to replicate the shroud image and concluded that it was produced by UV light, but the UV light necessary to reproduce the image exceeds the maximum power released by all UV light sources available today. The time for such a burst would be shorter than 1/40 billionth of a second, and the intensity of the UV light would have to be around several billion watts.
Sherlock Holmes, the great detective, when all possibilities have been eliminated, all suspects have been interviewed, and there's only one person left standing. No matter how improbable that may seem, it must be the truth.
This next clip is a reenactment of the resurrection.
Laser reference beam causes DNA to emit light.
As a result, an interference pattern of light waves was created.
Which is proof of what?
A paranormal event. Love is more powerful than death. Powerful than death.
So we have something real to offer to you today. We are bringing to the person that may be in darkness some light, the person who is in despair some hope, the person who has doubt some faith, the person who is in sadness a big bag of joy for you today. So give the Lord Jesus a chance. That said, thanks for watching this video. May the Holy Spirit of our Lord Jesus be with you.